My parents were super proud of me. Because I taught my sisters to live as servants, they had no clue I was actually teaching them how to flip a script. In my family, girls were raised to live life as men's personal slaves. It didn't matter if you were a toddler, teenager, or grandmother. The second you were able to walk in the men's eyes, you were ready to submit your life to us. Ever since birth, I was raised as my sister's and stepmother's owner, so in my head it didn't seem that crazy. Until I turned 12. I remember being fed grapes by my stepmother when I heard a loud thump from the other room, then screaming, then another thump, then finally silence. I turned my head and saw that it was my dad and my uncles wailing on my 8-year-old little sister, all because she accidentally spilled the glass of water she was fetching for my dad. My stepmother hurried over, but not to help. Instead, to clean the spill and apologize to the men. That's when I knew I couldn't be a part of this. The next morning, I told my dad I wanted to start training my sisters privately. I said I needed practice giving orders without adults watching. His face lit up like I'd told him I'd won the lottery. He actually pulled me into a hug and called me a natural-born leader. I took my sisters into my bedroom after breakfast that day. At first, they stood against my bedroom wall, shaking. The 10-year-old Aaliyah even instinctively started undoing her skirt, but when I stopped her, then patted my bed and told them both to sit, their expressions changed. And when I pushed my lunch tray between us and told them to eat, their jaws dropped. They damn near dropped to their knees thanking me. And it's while they were ravenously eating I dropped a bomb on them. I said I wanted to help them. They looked at me like I had 3 heads, then lunged in to hug me like they were never gonna let go. We spent that entire afternoon coming up with a plan to get them away from this hellhole. Our plan went into action that same day. In front of others, they'd serve me and act like I was their master. And in private, we'd plan their escape. At first, it worked beautifully. My parents praised me constantly. At family dinners, my dad would brag about how his daughters jumped at my smallest gesture. Stepmother told her friends I was gifted at commanding respect. They had no idea what was actually happening. The thing was, going through with this broke my heart. I had to watch my sisters wake at 4 to cook for me. I had to nod approvingly as my uncles ordered them to give massages. I had to strike them in front of everyone, then apologize over and over later as I cleaned their wounds in secret. But then one day, everything changed. I went up to the attic to retrieve photo albums for them to look at, and behind some boxes, I found a panel with documents inside. There, I found a medical degree with a specific name on it. It was my bio mother's name. I froze. I was always led to believe she never attended school and went insane and died right after my youngest sister was born. That's the story my father told me, at least. When I discovered that, I knew I had to act even more swiftly than before. I started going to internet cafes after school. I told my family I was going to religious studies as cover. I searched for hotline numbers, researched stories, what actual families looked like, how to help young girls escape abusive homes. I passed what I learned to my sisters. I gave them my pocket money and taught them to hide money in places only they cleaned. I taught them to memorize important phone numbers, important laws that made what our family did illegal. I thought we were getting close. But then that same week, everything exploded. My father didn't find anything hardcore, but he found a paper where Fatima, my 8-year-old sister, had written her own name. Just her name, nothing else. And he went absolutely ballistic. He paced around the house before announcing aloud that both sisters would be married off immediately to save them from corruption. I wanted to protest, but I stopped myself. I couldn't blow my cover, and so instead, I did something else. 3 days before the weddings were scheduled, Fatima told her teacher exactly what I'd taught her to say, word for word. And because this was the US after all, the school called authorities. Fatima was taken away before my parents could stop it. But here's the thing, Fatima was stressed. She gave the teacher the wrong address for our house. And because my dad had put down a fake address to the school in case something like this ever happened, CPS never showed up. When my dad learned of what happened in school, family connections are a beach. He tore the house apart looking for evidence of who'd corrupted Fatima, and that's when he found it. My hidden folder with everything, the photos of my sister's bruises, their notebooks where I had been teaching them to read and write, everything we were gonna use to help them escape. And my dad was mad, very mad. He burned everything immediately. But you see, I'm a boy, so he decided not to punish me. He decided to do something else. That night, he came into my room. He shook me awake and told me that my decision was very simple. Aaliyah, my 10-year-old sister's wedding, was tomorrow. Either I would officiate it and hand her over to my dad's 45-year-old friend, or he'd send Aaliyah somewhere that would make here feel like paradise. The morning came too fast, and at 5 a.m., they were already dressing her in red and gold, with her future husband waiting in our living room. I stood there watching them wrap the heavy jewelry around her tiny wrists. My hands shook as I gripped the ceremonial book my father had shoved into my hands moments earlier. The groom sat on our couch, picking at the fruit plate my stepmother had prepared, occasionally glancing at Aaliyah like she was merchandise he was inspecting. My father positioned himself behind me, his hand heavy on my shoulder. His fingers dug in just enough to remind me of his threat. I opened the book to the marked page, the Arabic words blurring as my eyes watered. Aaliyah stood perfectly still while my stepmother adjusted her veil, but I caught the tremor in her hands. The uncles filed into the room, taking their positions around the walls. My youngest uncle pulled out his phone to record. This would be shared later at the men's gatherings, proof of our family's devotion to tradition. I cleared my throat and began reading the opening prayers. That's when I noticed something. The groom kept checking his watch and shifting in his seat. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even nervous. An idea sparked. As I read, I deliberately mispronounced several words, making the kind of mistakes that would make any educated man cringe. The groom's eyebrows furrowed. I continued butchering the pronunciation while maintaining a serious expression. My father's grip tightened on my shoulder, but he couldn't correct me without admitting his son didn't know the proper ceremonies. The groom started looking genuinely concerned. Then I did something calculated. I stopped mid-sentence and turned to Aaliyah. "Show your future husband your hands," I commanded in Arabic. She extended her small hands, and I made a show of examining them. "They're shaking," I announced loudly. "She might be ill." The groom stood up immediately. At 45, he'd buried 2 wives already. The last thing he wanted was a sickly third one. He walked over and grabbed Aaliyah's wrist, feeling for her pulse. She played along perfectly, letting her knees wobble slightly. "The girl looks pale," the groom said to my father. "Is she healthy?" My father rushed to reassure him, but I interjected. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday. She said her stomach hurt." This was partially true. None of us had eaten much from stress. The groom dropped her wrist like it burned spurned him. "I need a healthy wife, not another burden," he said. "Get her checked by a doctor first." My father tried to protest, but the groom was already gathering his things. "I'll return when you have medical proof she's fit for marriage," he said. "I won't pay full price for damaged goods." After he left, my father's rage was volcanic. He grabbed the ceremonial book from my hands and threw it against the wall. My uncles quickly excused themselves, not wanting to witness what would come next. But instead of hitting me, my father did something worse. He grabbed Aaliyah by the hair and dragged her to the kitchen. "You've learned to act sick?" he screamed. "Let me give you a real reason to feel ill." He filled a bucket with ice water and forced her head under. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, before he pulled her up, gasping. My stepmother stood in the corner, wringing her hands but saying nothing. "Stop!" I shouted, surprising everyone, including myself. "You'll leave marks. The groom will think she's been struck." My father paused, considering this. Bruises would lower her bride price. He released her, and she collapsed on the kitchen floor, coughing up water. He turned to me with calculating eyes. "You're right," he said slowly. "We need her presentable. You'll take responsibility for preparing her properly. She stays in your room where you can monitor her health 1 week. If she's not ready by then, you'll both regret it." I helped Aaliyah to her feet, wrapping my arm around her shaking form. As we walked to my room, I felt my stepmother watching us. There was something different in her expression. Not sympathy exactly, but maybe recognition. That night, I gave Aaliyah my bed while I slept on the floor. She was still shivering from the ice water, so I piled every blanket I owned on top of her. Around midnight, she finally spoke. "The plan didn't work," she whispered. "He's just delayed it." I sat up in the darkness. "We bought time. That's what matters. A week isn't enough. It has to be." The next morning, I woke to my father standing over me. "Get up," he said. "New rules. Your stepmother will check on you both every hour. The girl doesn't leave this room except for bathroom breaks. You'll personally ensure she eats and gains weight. Make her marriageable." After he left, my stepmother entered with breakfast. She set the tray down and looked at me strangely. "Your mother was smart too," she said quietly. "It didn't save her." Before I could respond, she was gone. The first 3 days passed in a blur of forced feedings and hourly check-ins. I made Aaliyah eat everything brought to us, knowing my father would check her weight. During the brief moments between my stepmother's visits, I taught her phrases to memorize, emergency numbers, key English words, addresses of shelters. On the 4th day, something changed. My stepmother came in for her noon check and closed the door behind her. She pulled out a small flip phone from her pocket and handed it to me. "It's prepaid," she said, "hidden in the loose floorboard under the kitchen sink when you're done." I stared at her, speechless. "I can't save my own daughters," she continued, looking at Aaliyah. "They're married and gone, but maybe." She didn't finish the sentence. That night, I used the phone to record everything I could. I had Aaliyah describe what had happened to her, the beatings, the forced servitude. I took photos of old scars on her arms and back. I even managed to sneak into my father's office while he slept and photograph some of his papers, including what looked like forged documents about Aaliyah's age. On the 5th day, my father announced he'd found a doctor who would examine Aaliyah properly, meaning one who could be paid to say whatever my father wanted. The appointment was set for day 6. That night, I made a decision. I used the hidden phone to call the number I'd memorized weeks ago, a domestic violence hotline. The woman who answered listened as I explained everything in rushed whispers. She told me to call 911 immediately, but I knew my father had connections with local police. Instead, she gave me another number for a specialized unit that handled forced marriage cases. The 6th morning arrived too quickly. My father dressed Aaliyah himself, making sure she looked healthy and well-fed. The doctor arrived at our house. Apparently, we weren't even going to a real clinic. I watched from my doorway as this man examined my sister in our living room, checking her teeth like she was livestock. He declared her fit for marriage, and my father paid him in cash. The wedding was rescheduled for the next day. That night, desperation drove me to my final plan. I told Aaliyah to trust me no matter what happened. Then I did something that made me sick. I went to my father and told him I wanted to make the ceremony special. I suggested we hold it at the community center instead of our house, where more people could witness our family's honor. His pride won over his caution. He agreed immediately and spent the rest of the night calling relatives and friends to invite them. The more witnesses to his daughter's obedience, the better for his reputation. What he didn't know was that I'd already called the forced marriage unit. They'd be waiting. The morning of the wedding, I helped dress Aaliyah again. This time, I whispered constant reassurances as I fixed her veil. My stepmother watched us, her face unreadable. As we prepared to leave, she pressed something into my hand. "Car keys. The gray sedan parked 2 blocks down," she whispered. "It's registered to my sister. She doesn't know I borrowed it." I palmed the keys, my heart racing. We had a getaway car. The community center was already filling with guests when we arrived. My father strutted around, accepting congratulations for raising such an obedient daughter. The groom had arrived early, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a thick envelope, the bride price. I positioned myself at the front with the ceremonial book, Aaliyah standing to my left. The room fell silent as I began the opening prayers. This time, I recited them perfectly, my voice clear and strong. I needed everyone focused on the ceremony. Halfway through, right as I reached the part about the bride's consent, the doors burst open. The doors burst open, but it wasn't the authorities. It was my oldest uncle, the one who'd moved away years ago. He strode in wearing traditional robes, his face beaming with pride. My father's expression shifted from alarm to joy as he embraced his brother. "Continue," my uncle boomed. "I wouldn't miss my niece's wedding." My hands trembled as I resumed reading. The room settled back into expectant silence. I caught Aaliyah's eye. She looked confused and terrified. The plan was falling apart. I continued the ceremony, my mind racing for alternatives. The groom stepped forward, ready to accept his bride. That's when I noticed something. A small red stain spreading on Aaliyah's white dress. Blood. She must have scratched herself hard enough to bleed through the fabric. "Wait," I said loudly, pointing at the stain. "She's bleeding." The room erupted in whispers. The groom's face darkened as he examined the growing stain near her ribs. In our culture, any sign of illness or impurity could void a marriage contract. "What is this?" he demanded, turning to my father. My father grabbed Aaliyah's arm roughly, but I stepped between them. "Let me check," I said with authority. "I've been monitoring her health all week." I lifted the edge of her dress slightly, revealing deep scratches along her ribcage. Some looked fresh, others days old. The crowd gasped. The groom stepped back, disgust clear on his face. "You tried to sell me damaged goods," he spat at my father. "The girl is harming herself. She's mentally unstable." My father's father's face went purple with rage, but he couldn't explode in front of all these witnesses. The groom stormed out, taking his envelope of money with him. The guests began murmuring, some already heading for the exits. We drove home in suffocating silence. My father's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. My stepmother sat rigidly beside him while I held Aaliyah in the back seat, feeling her tremble against me. The moment we entered the house, my father's control shattered. He shoved Aaliyah against the wall, his hand raised to strike, but my uncle grabbed his wrist. Not the face, my uncle said calmly. She's still sellable, but clearly your methods aren't working. He looked at me with calculating eyes. The boy's too soft. Let me take over their training. My father nodded slowly, his rage redirecting toward me. You've failed me, he said. Both of you will learn what real discipline means. My uncle moved into our house that night. Unlike my father's explosive anger, his cruelty was methodical. He implemented a new system. Every mistake earned a mark in a notebook. 10 marks meant a punishment session. The first session happened 3 days later. Aaliyah had accumulated 10 marks for various infractions. Walking too slowly, not keeping her eyes down, forgetting to ask permission before using the bathroom. My uncle made me watch as he forced her to kneel on rice for an hour. Her knees bled through her dress, but she wasn't allowed to cry. You need to understand, my uncle told me afterward. Women are like animals. They only learn through pain. That night, I snuck into Aaliyah's room with bandages and antiseptic. As I cleaned her wounds, she grabbed my hand. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. I'd rather die. Don't say that, I begged. We'll find another way. But my uncle's presence made everything harder. He installed locks on the windows and confiscated the hidden phone my stepmother had given me. He went through my room daily, checking for contraband. He even started sleeping in the hallway, making nighttime escapes impossible. 2 weeks passed in this new hell. My uncle's notebook filled with marks. Aaliyah grew thinner despite forced feedings. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from lack of sleep. My uncle would wake her randomly throughout the night for obedience drills. Then my stepmother did something unexpected. During one of my uncle's punishment sessions, she suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed. My uncle stopped mid-strike. Alarmed, my father rushed to her side. My heart, she gasped. The stress. They called a private doctor, a real one this time. He insisted she needed rest and quiet, no disturbances. My uncle was forced to move his training sessions to the garage, giving us small windows of reprieve when my stepmother needed tending. During one of these breaks, my stepmother grabbed my wrist. Her collapse had been fake. There's a woman, she whispered. Mrs. Patterson. She teaches at your school. She's been asking about you. My English teacher. I'd missed weeks of school by now, my father claiming I was sick. She knows something's wrong, my stepmother continued. If you can get to her, but how? I was never alone anymore. My uncle accompanied me everywhere, even to the bathroom. The only time I left the house was for mosque, and my uncle sat right beside me. Then I remembered something. Next month was the religious festival. The entire community would gather at the Grand Mosque. It would be crowded, chaotic, maybe. I started playing a longer game. I became the perfect son, embracing my uncle's teachings. I participated enthusiastically in Aaliyah's punishments. I suggested harsher methods. It cold me inside, but I needed their trust. My transformation pleased them. My father started praising me again. My uncle began teaching me the finer points of control. He even showed me his notebook system, explaining how to track infractions efficiently. One evening, while demonstrating a proper disciplinary technique on Aaliyah, my uncle made a mistake. He struck her too hard across the back and she collapsed unconscious. Blood seeped through her dress. My father panicked. If she dies, we'll have authorities everywhere. They carried her to my room, ordering me to tend her wounds. As I cleaned the deep gash on her back, I realized this was evidence even they couldn't explain away. I carefully photographed it with an old digital camera I'd hidden months ago in my air vent. Aaliyah developed a fever that night. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. My father grew nervous enough to call the same doctor who'd examined my stepmother. The doctor took one look at Aaliyah's back and his face went pale. This needs a hospital, he said. No hospitals, my father said firmly, pressing money into the doctor's hand. You treat her here. The doctor reluctantly agreed, but warned that without proper care, infection could set in. He provided antibiotics and detailed instructions. My uncle was banned from touching her until she healed. During her recovery, I was her sole caretaker. I used these moments to whisper escape plans, though she was often too fevered to respond coherently. On the 4th night, she finally spoke clearly. Fatima, she said, have you heard anything? I shook my head. We'd had no news of our youngest sister since she'd been taken by authorities. I didn't even know if she was safe. I dream about her, Aaliyah continued. She's in a house with windows that open. She eats at a table with other children. She goes to school. That's not a dream, I told her. That's her future, and yours. But even as I said it, I wondered if we'd survive long enough to see it. My uncle grew impatient with Aaliyah's slow recovery. He started making comments about her being too much trouble and how my father should cut his losses. I knew what that meant. I'd heard stories of girls who disappeared, supposedly sent to relatives overseas but never heard from again. The religious festival was 2 weeks away. I maintained my facade of cruelty while secretly documenting everything. I photographed my uncle's notebook, recorded conversations on the old camera's video function, and collected evidence of the family's financial crimes my stepmother had hinted at. One night, while everyone slept, I managed to access my father's computer. His password was pathetically simple: his birthdate. I found folders full of documents, forged birth certificates, fake medical records, correspondence with other families about arrangements for their daughters. But the most shocking discovery was an email thread with a man in another state. They were discussing Fatima. My father was trying to get her back, claiming she'd been kidnapped by authorities. He'd hired lawyers, was preparing to file custody papers. The man was advising him on how to present himself as a grieving father whose child was stolen. I copied everything onto a flash drive, my hands shaking. If my father regained custody of Fatima. The next morning brought a new crisis. The groom from the failed wedding had returned, but not for Aaliyah. He wanted his deposit back, claiming my father had tried to defraud him. They argued in the living room while I listened from the hallway. You owe me compensation, the groom said, for my humiliation, my wasted time. The girl will be ready soon, my father insisted. Give me another month. I don't want that damaged goods, the groom spat, but I'll take the other one when she's old enough. They were talking about Fatima, planning her future sale before they even had her back. That night, I made a desperate decision. I snuck into my stepmother's room while she slept and took her phone. I had memorized Mrs. Patterson's number from a school directory months ago. My hands shook shook as I dialed. She answered on the third ring, her voice groggy. Hello? Mrs. Patterson, I whispered. It's me, from your English class. I need help. Oh my God, she breathed. We've been looking for you. Are you safe? No, I said. None of us are. Please, I don't have much time. I gave her our real address, described the situation in rapid whispers. She promised to act immediately. As I hung up, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I shoved the phone under my stepmother's pillow and crept back to my room, my heart hammering. The next day passed in agonizing normalcy. I kept expecting police to arrive, but nothing happened. Had Mrs. Patterson failed to reach anyone? Had my father's connections intercepted? That evening, my uncle announced a new plan. He'd found a better solution for Aaliyah. There was a man who ran a reform house for disobedient girls. They would send her there for proper training before attempting another marriage. I knew what these places were. Stories whispered among the women when they thought no one was listening. Girls went in. Not all came out. She leaves tomorrow night, my uncle said. After midnight, when the neighbors won't see. I had less than 30 hours. That night, I did something risky. I told Aaliyah the truth. All of it. About Mrs. Patterson. About the evidence I'd collected. About the plan to send her away. Her eyes went wide with terror. Tomorrow night, I said. Whatever happens, be ready to run. The next day crawled by. I maintained my cruel facade while internally screaming. My uncle spent the day packing Aaliyah's few belongings, humming cheerfully. My father counted money, payment for the reform house. My stepmother moved through the house like a ghost, her face blank. As evening approached, I noticed something odd. Cars kept driving slowly past our house. The same sedan circled the block 3 times. My uncle noticed too, frowning as he peered through the curtains. Probably nothing, my father said, but he looked uneasy. Dinner was tense. Aaliyah barely ate, her hands shaking. I forced myself to criticize her table manners, earning approving nods from my uncle. Inside, I was counting minutes. At 11 p.m., my uncle ordered Aaliyah to prepare for departure. She went to change clothes, and I followed, pretending to supervise. In her room, I pressed the car keys my stepmother had given me weeks ago into her palm. Gray sedan, 2 blocks north, I whispered. If you get the chance. She nodded, tucking the keys into her sleeve. We returned to the living room where my uncle waited with rope to bind her hands. For the journey, he said. As he reached for her, the doorbell rang. Everyone froze. Who would visit at 11 p.m.? My father approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. His face went white. Police, he hissed. My uncle grabbed Aaliyah, dragging her toward the back door. I had seconds to decide. Maintain my cover or act. The doorbell rang again, more insistent. I made my choice. I grabbed my uncle's notebook from the table and ran to the front door, throwing it open before my father could stop me. 2 officers stood there with Mrs. Patterson behind them. They're taking her out the back, I shouted. Chaos erupted. The officers pushed past my father, who tried to block them. I heard my uncle's cursing from the kitchen, Aaliyah's scream. My stepmother stood frozen in the hallway, her hand over her mouth. One officer radioed for backup to cover the rear exit. Through the window, I saw more police cars arriving, their lights painting our house in alternating red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their homes, watching the drama unfold. My uncle burst back into the living room, dragging Aaliyah. He saw the officers and dropped her arm, his face cycling through rage, fear, and calculation. My father started shouting about warrants, rights, religious persecution. We have a court order, one officer said calmly, producing papers, based on evidence of child abuse and attempted trafficking. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her eyes finding mine. Your teacher showed us everything, she said quietly. The photos, the recordings. You were very brave. My uncle lunged for me then, realizing my betrayal. An officer intercepted him, and within seconds he was on the ground in handcuffs. My father backed against the wall, his face a mask of disbelief. My own son, he said. You destroyed us. As they led my father and uncle away, my stepmother finally moved. She walked to Aaliyah and me, pulling us into an embrace. For the first time in my life, I saw her cry. Your mother would be proud, she whispered. Social workers arrived to process the scene. They spoke gently to Aaliyah, wrapping her in a blanket when they saw her shaking. One approached me with careful respect. You'll need to come with us, she said. All of you. There's a safe place waiting. As we prepared to leave the house that had been our prison, I remembered something. I ran to my room one last time, retrieving the flash drive with all the evidence. There would be trials, testimony, a long road ahead, but for tonight, we were free. In the back of the social services van, Aaliyah gripped my hand so tight it hurt. Through the window, I watched our house grow smaller, the police tape across the door glowing under streetlights. Neighbors still clustered on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves. What about Fatima? Aaliyah asked suddenly. The social worker turned from the front seat, smiling gently. She's safe, has been all along. You'll see her tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word felt foreign, impossible. We'd lived so long thinking only of surviving each day that the concept of a future seemed like fantasy. Mrs. Patterson followed in her own car. At every red light, I could see her checking her mirrors, making sure we were still there. She'd risked everything responding to my call, pushing authorities to act despite my father's connections. The safe house was nothing like I'd imagined. No bars on windows, no locks on doors, just a normal-looking home with warm lights and the smell of fresh bread. A woman met us at the door, introducing herself as Jamie, the house coordinator. You're safe here, she said simply. All of you. They gave us separate rooms but left the doors open so we could see each other. Aaliyah fell asleep almost instantly, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. I lay awake, staring at a ceiling without water stains, listening to sounds that weren't angry voices or crying. My stepmother sat by my bed for a while, not speaking. Finally, she pulled something from her pocket, a photograph, creased and worn. My biological mother, young and smiling, wearing a graduation cap. She tried to take you all and run, my stepmother said. The night before she died, your father caught her at the bus station. The next morning she was gone. He said it was her heart, but she didn't finish. She didn't need to. As dawn broke through curtains I was allowed to open, I thought about the trial ahead, about testifying against my father and uncle, about learning to live without fear, about seeing Fatima again. The middle part of our story was ending, but I knew the hardest chapter was just beginning. Recovery would be its own battle, but for the first time in my life, it was a battle we had a chance of winning. The morning sun streamed through unfamiliar curtains as I woke in the safe house bed. My stepmother was already gone, but the photograph of my biological mother lay on the nightstand. I tucked it into my pocket and went to check on Aaliyah. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. The bruises from the rope marks were already turning purple. I sat sat beside her, and she leaned into me without speaking. Jamie knocked softly before entering with breakfast trays, real plates, not the metal ones we used at home. She explained that a social worker would arrive soon to discuss next steps. My stomach churned at the thought of more strangers, more questions. The social worker turned out to be a soft-spoken woman who specialized in cases like ours. She interviewed each of us separately, taking careful notes. When my turn came, I handed over the flash drive with all the evidence I'd collected. Her expression grew grimmer with each file she opened. "This is extensive," she said. "You documented everything." I nodded, watching her scroll through photos of Aaliyah's injuries, the forged documents, the financial records. She paused at the email thread about Fatima. "We need to act on this immediately," she said, already pulling out her phone. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson arrived with clothes and school supplies she'd collected from other teachers. She hugged me tightly, and I surprised myself by not pulling away. She'd brought my backpack from school, still containing assignments from weeks ago. "The principal wants you to know you can return whenever you're ready," she said. No pressure. The thought of normal school seemed impossible. How could I sit in algebra class after everything that had happened? 2 days passed in a blur of interviews, medical exams, and legal consultations. The prosecutor assigned to our case was a no-nonsense woman who warned us the trial would be difficult. My father had hired expensive lawyers who were already spinning narratives about cultural misunderstandings and false accusations. On the third day, they finally brought Fatima. She looked different, healthier, wearing jeans and a pink sweater instead of the long dresses my father demanded. When she saw us, she broke free from her foster mother's hand and ran straight into Aaliyah's arms. They both sobbed while I stood awkwardly nearby until Fatima pulled me into their embrace. "They have a dog," Fatima whispered excitedly, "and I go to real school, and nobody hits me when I spill things." Her foster mother, Alexandra, watched from the doorway with kind eyes. She'd been caring for Fatima since the school intervention, slowly helping her adjust to normal childhood. She showed us photos on her phone. Fatima at a playground, eating ice cream, reading books. The reunion was bittersweet. We were together, but not really. Fatima would return to her foster home that evening. The court would decide our permanent placements after the trial. My stepmother surprised everyone by cooperating fully with prosecutors. She provided bank records, witnessed signatures, and testified about years of abuse she'd endured and witnessed. Her own daughters, my stepsisters, were located in other states, trapped in marriages my father had arranged years ago. The prosecutors added their cases to the charges. The trial date was set for 6 weeks away. My father and uncle remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk. Their lawyer tried to argue religious persecution, but the judge wasn't swayed by cultural defense for child abuse. During those weeks, we established new routines at the safe house. Aaliyah started attending therapy sessions, though she rarely spoke during them. I went back to school part-time, sitting through classes while my mind wandered. Mrs. Patterson checked on me daily, never pushing, but always available. The hardest part was learning to make choices. Simple things like what to eat for lunch or when to go to bed paralyzed me. I'd been trained to give orders, not make personal decisions. Jamie patiently guided us through these basic freedoms. One evening, my stepmother showed me more photos she'd hidden. My biological mother at university, at her medical school graduation, holding baby me at the hospital. In every picture, she radiated intelligence and determination. She was planning to divorce him and take you all to her sister in California, my stepmother explained. She'd been saving money, gathering documents. Then one morning, she just collapsed. The implications hung heavy between us. My stepmother had lived with this knowledge for years, powerless to act, watching my father trap her biological daughters the same way. As the trial approached, the prosecutor prepared us for testimony. She warned that my father's lawyers would try to discredit us, paint me as a rebellious son destroying his family over teenage angst. They'd claim the injuries were self-inflicted, the documents forged by me. The first day of trial, I wore the only suit that fit, one Mrs. Patterson's husband had lent me. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Our case had attracted attention. Forced child marriage in suburban America made headlines. Inside the courtroom, I saw my father for the first time since his arrest. He'd lost weight, his beard unkempt. When our eyes met, his expression shifted from hatred to something like disappointment. My uncle sat beside him, avoiding eye contact entirely. The prosecutor opened with the physical evidence, photos of injuries, medical reports, the forged documents. She played recordings I'd made of my father discussing marriage prices. The judge's face remained impassive, but I caught jurors wincing at certain details. When my turn came to testify, my legs shook walking to the witness stand. The prosecutor guided me through questions about our household, the expectations, the punishments. I described finding my mother's medical degree, teaching my sisters to read, the night Fatima was struck for spilling water. Cross-examination was brutal. My father's lawyer, a polished man named Vic, picked apart every statement. He suggested I'd coached my sisters, that I'd fabricated evidence out of resentment over strict parenting. He painted my father as a traditional man trying to preserve cultural values in a permissive society. "Isn't it true you resented the responsibility your father gave you?" Vic asked. "I resented watching my sisters be tortured," I replied. "You mean disciplined? I mean tortured." He showed photos of our house. Clean, well-furnished, expensive. Evidence of provision, he claimed. He questioned why I'd waited so long to act if things were truly so bad. "Because I was 12, I said, and terrified, and trained from birth that this was normal." Aaliyah's testimony was harder to watch. She spoke barely above a whisper, describing the marriage preparation, the ice water punishment, years of servitude. She showed the scars on her knees from kneeling on rice. Vic tried to suggest she'd hurt herself, but the medical examiner's testimony contradicted him. My stepmother's testimony provided crucial context. She detailed the financial transactions, the communications with other families, the network of arranged marriages my father facilitated. She admitted her own complicity while explaining the impossibility of escape. "Where would I go?" she asked. "He controlled everything. Money, documents, connections. My own family would have sent me back." The prosecution presented evidence of my father's attempts to regain custody of Fatima, his emails calling her foster placement kidnapping. They showed the marriage contracts, some for girls as young as 9. Bank records revealed payments received for introducing young girls to older men. Fatima testified via closed-circuit video, too young to face my father directly. She described the beatings, the hunger when she was punished with food food denial, the terror of never knowing what would trigger violence. When asked about her current life, her face lit up describing school, friends, her foster family's patience with her nightmares. The defense's case relied heavily on cultural relativism and attacking our credibility. They brought character witnesses who described my father as a pillar of the religious community. They suggested American authorities were destroying immigrant families over misunderstood traditions, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: child abuse, attempted trafficking, document fraud, tax evasion. My father's face went ashen as the judge read the verdicts. Sentencing would come later, but the prosecutor assured us he'd face decades in prison. My uncle was convicted on fewer charges, but still faced significant time. Several other men in our community were arrested based on evidence uncovered during the investigation. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Mrs. Patterson and the prosecutor shielded us, guiding us to waiting cars. I glimpsed my father being led away in shackles, looking somehow smaller than the monster of my memories. The next months blurred together. Custody hearings determined our placements. The judge wanted to keep us together, but practicalities intervened. Fatima's foster family petitioned to adopt her, and the stability they offered outweighed separation concerns. Aaliyah and I were placed with a family experienced in trauma cases. The Benjamins lived 2 hours from Fatima, close enough for regular visits. They had a daughter in college and experience fostering teenagers from difficult backgrounds. Moving in with strangers felt surreal. They showed us our rooms, actual privacy, doors that locked from the inside. They explained house rules gently, emphasizing these were for everyone's comfort, not control. Still, I found myself asking permission for everything, unsure how to exist without orders. School remained challenging. Word had spread about the trial, and classmates either avoided me or asked invasive questions. Mrs. Ed Patterson advocated fiercely, ensuring I received accommodations for missed work and counseling support. Aaliyah struggled more visibly. She barely ate, spoke only when necessary, and panicked when male teachers approached. The Benjamins found her a therapist who specialized in trauma from forced marriage attempts. Progress was slow, measured in tiny victories like choosing her own clothes or speaking up about food preferences. We visited Fatima monthly. Each time she seemed more like a normal child, giggling, playing, complaining about homework. Her nightmares had decreased, though she still sometimes woke screaming about spilled water. Her adoptive parents, Alexandra and her husband, included us naturally in family events, understanding our need to maintain connection. My father's sentencing hearing arrived 6 months after the verdict. The judge allowed victim impact statements. I'd prepared remarks but found myself unable to deliver them. Instead, I submitted a written statement about the childhood he'd stolen, the mother he'd likely murdered, the sisters he'd tried to sell. He received 40 years. My uncle got 25. They'd be old men if they ever got out.